Чимби, камифа скустрак, и проят вият вайра, камифа скустрак, миво, чимби, камифа скустрак, и проят вият вайра.
Since their first devastating use back in 1945, nuclear weapons have been a huge source of anxiety and fear across the globe. For almost a century now, we've lived in the knowledge that our world leaders could plunge us into nuclear war of destruction on a scale never before seen in history. But how likely really is this scenario? What was their biggest nuclear weapon ever dropped? And how does a nuke even work anyway? Slip your hazmat suit on and brace yourself for impact, because you're about to get hit with a fat knowledge bomb. Let's start with a little history and ask the question, why were nuclear bombs ever developed in the first place? In 1938, just a year before the world was plunged into war, German scientist Otto Hahn was working in a lab in Berlin when he discovered something incredible: nuclear energy. By splitting the nucleus of an atom, the smallest unit of matter in the known universe, Hahn realized a monumental amount of energy was released. After word got out about his findings, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was worried that the Germans would use this newfound energy to develop a superweapon. So, he asked U.S. scientists to develop one first. When America joined World War II in December 1941, these efforts were doubled, and Roosevelt established the Manhattan Project. Based in Manhattan, New York, the project was a joint effort by the military and several hundred scientists to weaponize nuclear energy. Just 4 years after its formation, its goal was met. On the 16th of July, 1945, the U.S. conducted the first ever test of a nuclear bomb, codenamed the Trinity Test. The bomb, containing 1 kiloton of destructive power, was the same as 1,000 tons of conventional explosives, was dropped from a plane over Socorro, New Mexico. The resulting explosion stunned the U.S. military and left the bomb site so irradiated that even today, the area contains more than 10 times the normal level of background radiation. In other words, it was a resounding success. Less than a month later, the U.S. would put this terrifying new technology to horrific use. With the war almost over, but Japan refusing to surrender, newly instated President Harry S. Truman ordered the atomic bombing of the city of Hiroshima. When the bomb named Little Boy was dropped, everything changed.
Bukan
The
Little
plane
Baby.
chosen for the mission, a B-29 Super Fortress bomber called the Enola Gay, reached Hiroshima
I thought it was
at
Little
9:14
Baby, the
a.m. local
name.
time on the 6th of August, 1945. The bombardier, Thomas Farabee, dropped the near 10,000-pound bomb. Then the pilot, Paul Tibbets, sharply turned and flew away from the city as fast as he could. 43 seconds later, Little Boy exploded with the force of more than 16,500 tons of TNT. The nuclear explosion instantly vaporized anyone at its center, scorched the ground around it to temperatures hotter than 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and sent a shockwave that smashed through buildings and obliterated land for miles around. It was hell on earth. A daunting mushroom cloud soared in the air 20,000 feet above the city, blocking out sunlight to those below. But still, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito refused to back down. Surprised, but unperturbed, Truman ordered the dropping of a second bomb, this time over the city of Nagasaki. This bomb, named Fat Man, was even bigger and more powerful than its predecessor. Just 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, Fat Man fell from the U.S. plane and exploded over Nagasaki, might have been better off being vaporized than being a little further out when the bomb went off. Those not in the immediate blast suffered all kinds of nasty maladies, like burns, internal injuries, and blindness, and many succumbed to them. Emperor Hirohito, seeing such destruction, finally announced the country's surrender. At the cost of over 200,000 innocent lives, the Allies had won the war. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the newly formed United Nations made one of their first acts to call for the elimination of atomic weapons. And even less unsurprisingly, this was completely ignored. In the years following the war, the U.S. continued testing atomic bombs, and the Soviet Union, under communist rule and firmly against the American way of life, accelerated their own nuclear program. In 1949, the Soviet Union became the second nation to successfully detonate a nuclear bomb. The Cold War had officially begun. Two nations with wildly conflicting belief systems, both harboring the most powerful weapons mankind had ever seen. What could possibly go wrong? You know where you can't go wrong, though, hitting those like and subscribe buttons down below. So you get amazing recommendations and content like this delivered to your homepage almost every single day. Anyway, back to blowing stuff up. In 1952, 3 years after the Soviet Union's first successful nuclear test, and with Cold War tensions rising ever higher, the U.S. took nuclear weaponry to a whole new level by detonating the first ever hydrogen bomb. Can you guess how much more powerful this hydrogen bomb was than the OG atom bombs? 10 times? 100 times? No, it was 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Or when obliterating an entire city just isn't enough. When the bomb exploded over a remote Pacific island, it did so with a monumental force of 10.4 megatons of TNT. That's over 10 million tons of the stuff. The colossal blast made a fireball at least 4 miles wide that, by expert estimates, shone brighter than 1,000 suns. And the heat was felt by observers standing as far as 80 miles away. But the Soviets were hot on the US's tail, and if you thought what you just saw was big, strap yourselves in because you've seen nothing yet. Let's put things into perspective for a moment. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was 15 kilograms. The first hydrogen bomb was 10 megatons.
That's crazy.
But 9 years later, in 1961, the Soviets tested a hydrogen bomb that was an unbelievable 57 megatons. That's 3,800 times the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The absolute behemoth of the weapon was called the Tsar Bomba, and measured in at 26 feet long as well as weighing 27 metric tons. About 6 times the weight of Little Boy, and over twice the length. The monstrous superweapon was so big that it didn't even fit inside a plane, and had to be carried underneath instead. You've got a feel for the poor pilot. He and his crew were only given a 50-50 chance of surviving the test. On October 30th, 1961, the plane carrying the bomb took off and flew towards the test site, an island in the Arctic Ocean named Novaya Zemlya. Once over the island, the crew released the payload and got the hell out of there as fast as they could. To give them more time, the enormous explosive had been fitted with a parachute to slow its descent. Even so, when it detonated, the blast was so powerful that its shockwave slammed into the plane, sending it plummeting over 3,000 feet. Luckily, the pilot recovered control, but the explosion annihilated everything within 22 miles and created a massive mushroom cloud over 37 miles high. The bomber's crew, still hurtling away as fast as they could, watched as the beautiful, terrifying plume pierced the sky where they'd been mere moments before. In reality, the test was nothing more than Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev flexing his military muscle to show the U.S. who was boss. But the bomb itself, while undoubtedly impressive, was impractical and wasn't as effective as dropping several small bombs. So no attempt on either side was ever made to make one bigger.
Wih,
Even today, the
Bald
Tsar Bomba
Eagle
remains the
Boy.
biggest nuclear weapon ever created
7
and
Juli.
used. Though
Nada rich
I
sekarang nih
came
kan.
pretty
Nada
close to
rich.
topping it after
Nada
last
rich
night's
sudah
curry.
nih. Tapi
Despite no single
Bald
bomb
Eagle
ever
nih
matching
boy.
the Tsar
Kita
Bomba's
dapat sudah
power,
nih boy.
between 1945 and 1980, a combined total of
July
510
7. Apa?
megatons of explosives
Much
were
is this
detonated
worth?
around the
Totalnya 1
world in
billion.
nuclear tests. That's 170
Zero.
times more blast
Lai
powder than was used in the
bangkan.
whole of World War II.
$0.
And though easily the two
Hey,
biggest culprits, it wasn't
$0.
just the US and Soviet Union that
Mati
were
kali boy.
responsible for the barrage of blasts.
Hey,
By 1980, the UK, France, and
Make
China had all
panggang.
waded into the fray with their own
Suka makan
tests,
panggang.
albeit on a far smaller
Wih,
scale. With 5
still,
nations all blowing the
I have
living
so many
daylights out
things
of a
already.
barren patch of land they could
July
find,
great.
you might
Wih,
expect there to be some
Wih.
environmental
Wajar.
consequences, right?
Apa nih?
Well, we can't be sure just how much radioactive
Wih.
material has been flung up into the atmosphere from the decades of
Hmm.
testing. But we know it's a lot. Like, a lot. And what goes up
Just shoot it
must
up,
come
I
down.
guess.
Throughout the Cold War, one of the
Grow
Soviets'
a
favorite
garden.
nuclear
Grow
test
a
sites
garden.
was a patch of land
Wow.
in Semipalatinsk,
Grow a
Kazakhstan,
garden.
called
Grow
the
a
Polygon.
garden. Wow.
Even today, this area
Nih,
is one of the most
lipat
radioactive
nih
places in the
apa
whole
nih?
world. It's been hit with
Boleh.
about 450
Tapi
nuclear
anu
explosions,
macam
and with every single one, masses
pakai
of radioactive
fire
dust and
flower.
dirt were blown into the air and carried
Wih.
across the neighboring communities as
Tapi
toxic fallout.
menapu.
A test in
Wih.
1956 resulted in over
Wih,
600 residents
prickly
of the city
pen
of
ada
Ust-Kamenogorsk being rushed to hospital with
Nita
radiation sickness, and they were
Open,
250
Uncle Bob.
miles away.
Uncle Bob,
Now, trust
Uncle
me,
Sam.
you don't want to get radiation
Pani.
sickness. If you're ever
Bald
subjected to a
Eagle.
strong dose of radiation, the
Americano
symptoms can
punya
be
dia.
severe and quick to set
Aku
in.
pun tidak tahu.
The invisible rays penetrate your body, so they don't just damage your skin,
Oke,
but
oke,
also
oke,
your
oke.
insides.
Dam
The
dek,
cells
oke,
that make your
oke,
hair
oke.
die off, causing you to lose it.
Oke.
Your disease-fighting
Fire
white blood cells
flow
die
works
too, crippling
Pani.
your immune system.
You grow
Even
more
your
worth
very
it, is it?
DNA is attacked,
You grow more
causing it
seed,
to break
is
and
it?
mutate. You'll
Okay,
feel sick,
okay,
weak, and disoriented. Even if you survive
Kita
the initial
pelan
dose of
macam mana
radiation,
ni?
years
Macam
later, you're more
anomaly.
likely to develop
If no gap
life-threatening
on,
illnesses
if no
like
gap,
leukemia
no
or
gap, no
cancer.
gap.
That's
gap,
exactly
no
what
gap.
happened with the
Don't
many
have no gap
residents
beda.
of
Oke,
Ust-Kamenogorsk.
sekarang
But the
bagi
tests didn't just affect
selebriti,
one
boy.
generation of people. Because
Selebriti
DNA mutations are often passed on.
macam ini.
Pregnant women at the time were
Pani.
more likely to give birth to children with learning difficulties or
Kacang,
physical
boy.
impairments. Overall, the tests in Semipalatinsk alone are estimated to have affected over
simpan
350,000 people
Berapa ya?
across 3 generations. Jeez. But what actually is it that makes these
Terlingkan
monstrous
good
weapons so
Besek
preposterously
saja,
powerful?
boy.
How did we go from
Ada yang
conventional
bilang,
bombs to
"Oke."
colossal weapons of mass destruction
Dan
in the space of just a few years? To find out, we need to return to our German
Oi.
scientist Otto Hahn back in
Legging sudah
1938.
bang,
You see,
legging sudah.
he didn't just discover
Oi,
nuclear energy.
legging
He
sudah.
discovered something called nuclear fission. And it's the entire reason that we're now capable of our own Armageddon. Okay, so here's the sitch. Everything in the universe is made of atoms. You, me, the chair you're sat on, even your grand's false teeth. They're so small, you can't even see them with a microscope, but they're everywhere. Inside every atom is a nucleus containing a load of protons, which are positively charged, and neutrons, which have no charge. These are bound together tightly to the nucleus, which takes a great deal of energy to keep together, because naturally things that have the same charge repel one another. Think about magnets. If you try to push two magnets together, positive to positive, there's resistance. If you let go of those magnets, they'd spring backwards, releasing kinetic energy as they did so. It's the same principle here. The protons are held together by a powerful force. But if that force is broken, all the energy being contained by it is released. This process is called nuclear fission, and it's the principle behind both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atom bombs. To instigate fission, a neutron is fired at the nucleus of an atom. When it hits the nucleus, it smashes it apart, forming two smaller nuclei and releasing energy in the form of heat. At the same time, some neutrons are flung from the nuclei entirely and go on to hit other atoms, splitting their nuclei and creating a chain reaction. In this way, a massive amount of heat energy is produced that increases exponentially in just a fraction of a second. And it's all reliant on reactions in the nucleus. Nucleus, nuclear, get it? It's the basic process that powers all nuclear weapons. And most nuclear power plants use it to generate electricity too. However, just to throw a spanner in the works, there is another way of creating nuclear energy called nuclear fusion. This is much more powerful than fission and is used to power hydrogen bombs. Here, instead of splitting atoms apart, they're fused together. Fusion only works with small atoms, like hydrogen, the nucleus of which contains just one proton. Naturally, two hydrogen atoms repel one another because they're both positively charged. But if the force repelling is overcome,
very
and they're
easy untuk
impelled to
jadi.
fuse with one another, creating a bigger atom and releasing a huge amount of energy in the process.
Kangkung.
So, how do you overcome the powerful force repelling the atoms and fuse them together? Well, you need to compress them into as small a space as you can so they're more likely to collide and blast them with an absolute butt ton of heat. This way, they're not only closer to one another, but the heat makes them move faster. And when I say a butt ton of heat, I mean at least 180 million degrees Fahrenheit. Ooh,
Moon
spicy.
blossom.
For comparison, that's
Moon
almost 7
blossom.
times
Mana
hotter
we have a
than the
moon
sun,
blossom?
which also runs off nuclear
Apa
fusion.
nih?
Because of the immense gravitational
Sugar
pressures at the sun's
apple
core, about
cheater.
200 billion
Sugar
times greater than the
apple
atmospheric
pula.
pressure here on Earth, atoms are crushed so close together that it doesn't need to be so hot for fusion to
Tuh
occur.
lagi tamu aku belum
We
manggai.
need to make up for the
Suka
lack
makan
of
mangga.
pressure ramping up the
Mantai.
heat. And you
Mantul
know what
mantul.
generates a lot of heat? Yeah, nuclear
Paradise
fission.
Egg 2
Therefore,
ada
hydrogen
2.
bombs, otherwise
Paradise
known as
Egg ada 2
thermonuclear
banggal.
weapons, explode
Wes
using the
manis
heat from a
itu.
fission reaction to
Bald
kickstart a
Eagle
more
Zero,
powerful fusion
$0.
reaction. In other
Mimic
words, when a
octopus
hydrogen
make
bomb
me
goes
rich.
off, it burns 7 times hotter than the sun. Whew.
Rosie
Okay,
did
if you're with me so far,
Bango.
give yourself a
I
pat
thought
on
we
the
were going
back.
to.
Now we know the
Jai
basic reaction powering the bombs. But how do the bombs themselves
Kenapa
actually
kau
work?
di sini, Bang?
Let's start with the fuel
Bang,
inside,
kenapa kau di
which
sini,
is
Bang?
either uranium-235 or
Betul. Apa nih?
plutonium-239.
Apa nih?
These are both
Apa nih?
radioactive metals, meaning their
Oi,
atoms have
Jai, oi.
unstable nuclei.
Wuih,
An unstable
Oh,
nucleus
fireworks
has too
it.
many neutrons or protons inside it,
firework.
and will eject them to try and become
Tapi
stable.
saya
This
kayu
is
yang sudah
called
kayu.
radioactive decay,
Kayu,
and it produces
jangan
energy in the form
kayu.
of radiation. Atoms
Kayu.
with unstable nuclei are also
Kayu.
easier to split
For
with nuclear fission,
14th of
hence why they're
July
used in nuclear weapons.
shop.
Now, Little Boy's
Celebrate
design
July,
was very
celebrate
simple.
July.
The bomb had two
Open.
separate pieces of
Liberty Lily
uranium-235 inside
jadinya.
it, the plug and the target. Upon detonation, several
Jadinya
thousand
firework.
pounds of conventional
Ini
explosive was
July
set
ini
off
bot
inside the shell,
legalnya.
which fired the
Iya,
plug
tapi
down a
ini
barrel
anggal
to the
sama
target. The two pieces of uranium smashed together, compressing the atoms close enough to instigate a fission reaction, which grew in power exponentially until it exploded out from the bomb's shell in a fearsome fireball.
makan nambuk.
All nuclear weapons produce
Ambuk
this fireball,
hitam.
and it expands so
ambuk
fast that in a
hitam,
1
ambuk
megaton
hitam.
hydrogen bomb,
Suka
which is far
makan
more powerful
sekarang.
than Little Boy was,
Ambuk
it
hitam
can
di
reach
kelapa.
440
Suka
feet across in less than a
Dalam.
millisecond. You see,
Nah,
Little Boy was
saya
actually
duri.
pretty inefficient, which is why nobody ever made any bigger, more powerful versions of the weapon. Fat Man, the bomb dropped on Nagasaki, had a very different design.
Mau expand
Instead of
na na ya.
uranium-235, Fat Man was powered by
Too much
plutonium-239.
money.
However, the plutonium-239 used had trace amounts of plutonium-240 in it. This is a different kind of plutonium called an isotope. Plutonium-240 has a higher fission rate than plutonium-239, which means if the same gun-type design as Little War was used, it would have begun fission before the two masses of plutonium had been brought together. This would have made it so inefficient, it wouldn't have been worth using. So another design was developed. For Fat Man, one plutonium sphere